This is Jonathan Reutenberg, and you're listening to Let's Talk About Things. And a belated happy Juneteenth to everyone. Today is the day after Juneteenth that this is being recorded. In fact, it is the first Juneteenth that is a federal holiday. For the first time, Juneteenth is a federal holiday in the United States due to a law that was signed last week. And I've talked a lot about this on Twitter. I know others have as well, including Sarah Quinlan, who, by the way, is going to be my guest today. But I just want to take a few minutes before that to talk about my thoughts. I think that the fact that it took so long for them to make Juneteenth a holiday, I think is unfortunate. But I'm glad that they did, and I think it was the right decision. This is not some woke new holiday. It is, in fact, a long-standing celebration within the African American community. And when you take a moment to think about what it's really celebrating, it actually seems appropriate. Because the fact that America had slavery in the early part of its history, I think was a betrayal of her founding ideals. And the abolition of slavery, in my opinion, was a coming-of-age moment for America. A moment in which America took one step closer to her founding ideals. And, there were some objections from a number of Republicans, like Thomas Massey was one of the no votes on this, and he supported the idea in principle, but he said that he objected to the name Juneteenth National Independence Act. And this leads to a point that I want to talk about. Juneteenth and Independence Day, in a way, go hand in hand with each other. Because Independence Day on July 4th celebrates America's independence from Britain, and Juneteenth celebrates African Americans' independence from slavery. And the uncomfortable truth is, when America declared its independence and became free, some Americans were not free. They were enslaved. And you had rulings like the Dred Scott decision, which declared essentially that black people were not people. And I think that the fact that America has done so much to correct those old injustices is worth celebrating, because I don't believe that obviously slavery is not compatible with a free nation, and I think most people would not dispute that. But I think the fact that we took that step in abolishing slavery is something that's worth celebrating, certainly. And so in that sense, I think that the fact that more Americans became free and were able to share in the promise of the Declaration of Independence and the government guaranteed by the Founding Fathers, I think that's something that's worth celebrating, and that's why I think Juneteenth and 4th of July go hand in hand. Matt Rosendale was of the opinion, he was one of the no votes, and he said that we can't celebrate our independence without the left bringing up a dark moment in America's history. Well, on the contrary, I don't think that the abolition of slavery was a dark moment in American history. I think that slavery was a dark moment. I think its abolition was a bright moment. And I think that's something that's I keep saying this. I'm going to become a broken record at this point, but it's worth celebrating in my opinion. And, I say this as an outsider because obviously I'm Canadian, I live in Canada. Canada did not have the same type of history with slavery that America did. In fact, most of the provinces of Canada were among the first places in the world to abolish slavery in the late 18th century, early 19th century. Quebec and Ontario and Nova Scotia, in one way or another, abolished slavery in the late 18th century. At the time, Quebec and Ontario were known as Lower and Upper Canada. And the rest of the British Empire abolished slavery in 1832 or 1833. And as a result, during the period leading up to the Civil War, like the decades preceding the Civil War, many people who escaped slavery, would often flee to Canada. And Canada, for their part, served as a refuge. They refused to turn over people who were enslaved. And in fact, I remember reading in school stories of people, of slave catchers who would cross the border to retrieve escaped slaves, and they were not welcome on the Canadian side of the border very much. And that's why I feel like it's worth mentioning, because Canada has an interesting role that they played in this particular episode. And just one more point worth mentioning, because I feel like it leads to an interesting counterfactual, because it ties back into to Independence Day. What if America lost the Revolutionary War? Well, I would say, first of all, that maybe America would have evolved the same way that much of the British Empire did, in which the colonies slowly became democratic institutions. One consequence of might have been that slavery would have been abolished earlier, which would, I'd say, obviously would be a good thing. But I also think that it doesn't necessarily mean that the idea of freedom itself would have died out. I think that the ideas of freedom and individual liberty, Lockean idea of individual liberty, like life, liberty, and property, those ideas predated the American Revolution. They were the spark of the American Revolution. And even if the people who fought the revolution failed, the ideas would not have died out. They would have continued to fester. They would have continued to spread. And you might have seen America evolve in a similar way to that the rest of places like Canada and Australia and New Zealand did, maybe with slavery abolished sooner. It's just an interesting counterfactual. Obviously, it's hard to speculate how history would have unfolded, because history only unfolds one way. There are many ways the future can unfold. There's only one way that the past unfolded. But it's just an interesting counterfactual to think about nonetheless. Anyway, we've got a great show. I'm going to be talking with Sarah Quinlan in just a moment, so stick around. All right, joining me now is someone who I have actually been wanting to talk to for a while. You may know her from her writing at Arc Digital. Sarah Quinlan is my guest on the show. Thank you so much for joining me, Sarah.
Thank you for having me. This is so exciting.
For those of you who don't know, Heath Mayo was organizing these Principal First gatherings in 2019, and I believe that is where you and I first met.
That sounds right, up in New York City.
Yep, in New York City. We were both in New York City at the time. But you've had your own personal journey to where you are right now, to writing for Arc Digital. I think you were writing for Red State at one point.
Yes, I wrote for Red State for about a year. I think March 2017 to March 2018, if I can remember years correctly.
Do you want to talk about your journey from Red State blogger to Principals Firster, writing for Arc Digital?
Sure. It was, let's see, I've always been conservative, registered Republican, as soon as I could vote, always voted Republican, just never really thought too much about it. It was just kind of like part of who I was. I didn't even think about it. This is what I believed in. And I had never really thought of politics as a career beyond actually running for office, which I wasn't interested in. And then as 2016 rolled around, I started feeling as though, and this is probably a realization other people have had much earlier in their lives, but for me, I realized in 2016, 2015, that I couldn't count on other people to defend the principles that I believed in. I was a Republican because it was the right vehicle for the beliefs that I believed in. I thought that they promoted and defended and protected free market, free speech, limited government principles. And 2015 and 2016 was kind of when I realized, the party may not always be the best vehicle for supporting those principles. And so that was kind of when I started looking around at what was being written about politics and political commentary. And I didn't feel as though there was anyone out there who was consistently writing the things I wanted to read the way that I wanted them written about. It seemed as though it was a lot of talking to an audience that already agreed with you, or it was, I didn't fully understand some things about why people on the right oppose things that I thought they should support. And so finally I was just like, if I can't find someone who's writing about things the way I like, I'll just try writing about it myself. So I started at the Buckley Club, which was a super small blog, but basically just I had tweeted a thread, and the founder asked me to put into a piece, and then that turned to Red State, which I really appreciated the opportunity to write at Red State because it was a different audience, and I valued kind of the opportunity to maybe try to de-escalate situations. Again, a lot of times it does seem as though people are writing for an audience that already agrees with them. And I wanted to write to an audience that may believe the same things I do, but come to different conclusions. especially when it comes to like culture and like social issues. It just seems like there's just so much anger and everyone is just yelling at each other instead of actually talking to each other. And then after Red State is when I started writing for Arc Digital. And Red State was very much I was writing like a piece. I tried to write a piece every single day. Whereas Arc Digital, I can kind of slow down a bit and spend a bit more time on my pieces, which is good because I need a lot of time to write pieces. I always read and edit them like multiple times to make sure I'm saying exactly what I want to be saying.
And I have to say, someone who's read your writing, certainly at Arc Digital, I think I was a bit less. I actually didn't, first of all, didn't know who you were back when you were writing for Red State, but as reading your work for Arc Digital, I can see your thoughts sort of flow from your writing, if that makes any sense. But and I have to say, I think of everyone who I've encountered online, you, I think, express the views that I think I hold in terms of how I would apply my conservative principles, in the belief in small government, and the belief that our private sector is capable of doing a lot of good, and the as well as the ability of the individual to succeed. And I think we both come from very same mindset. I don't see a lot of people, I think, besides you, expressing that online. So that's why I always appreciate whenever you put out an article like that, like the one that you put out just like a couple weeks ago on what happened with January 6th.
It's always so nice when someone agrees with your writing because it's a very intimidating thing to put your thoughts out into the world for people to criticize and even misunderstand. There's been a lot of times where people took me in bad faith or assumed that I was arguing something I wasn't trying to, which is definitely difficult. So it's always nice to hear that someone agrees with my writing.
So I guess I just have a question. Like, we're gonna get into the heavy stuff. Earlier this year, rather started late last year, when Trump lost re-election, he proceeded to delegitimize the whole system, and Congress was attacked on January 6th. And you'd think that this would have been like a wake-up call, but instead, we're at a point where all three of the Republicans in the House leadership believe the same thing that Trump does. And someone who thinks that there should be a coup d'etat served as 24 days as national security advisor. And as well as the president who is denied a second term by the voters, he now leads in the primaries for 2024. And lawmakers, who had their lives threatened on January 6th, voted to block a commission to investigate the events of that day. And I guess my question is, how did we get here?
That's a great question. I wish I knew. Sometimes it feels as though this is like, what's that, like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, where people I agreed with for years and really respected, now I look at them and I'm like, what are you saying? Like, what are you doing? Like, this goes against everything you would have said 6 or 7 years ago. So I don't know. It's definitely challenging. I try to stay optimistic, and I believe that our government and our system is stable enough that we can get through this. But, you never think that you'll be alive for these times in history.
I'm reminded of something that Ronald Reagan said. I didn't leave the Democratic Party left me. And I feel in many ways, I didn't leave the Republican Party left me. And we didn't change, they did.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. And I think you can see that even in just like the platforms. Like in 2020, we didn't have a Republican platform for the election. It was just basically, we support Donald Trump and whatever Donald Trump supports. And it just feels as though so many prominent people in the party have flipped on what they used to believe in.
I'm reminded of, the fact that people don't know this, but when Charlie Kirk first founded Turning Point USA, it was focused on economic issues. But really, I think what we've come to know him as, and to a certain and to extent Candace Owens as well, is, if you can believe it, at a Turning Point USA event, I think it was Turning Point USA, someone was defending, in criticizing the Green New Deal, the right of people to fart. That is where we are.
Ah,
Just, but it's just an example of, I think, of what you said of the party is sort of, and the movement, in some ways, like, and the media apparatus, I feel like is become unrecognizable. You had people like Mark Levin and Glenn Beck who were actually opposed to Trump in the 2016 election, but
mhm.
once he won, they went all in.
Yeah. One thing that I try to remember is often the loudest voices are the most extreme voices. I encourage anyone to speak up if they don't like what's going on within the party right now or within politics, just because more moderate voices, less angry voices really tend to get tuned out. Anger really fires people up and gets the most attention. Negativity gets the most attention. And so I think at this point there is, for lack of a better description, like a moral imperative to like step up, speak out, try to reduce the tension in the room, and try to have conversations across the aisle.
I wish people would do that. I wish more people would, be like lawmakers like John Katko or Mitt Romney, Adam Kinzinger, Liz Cheney, because I feel like they have courage. But even if you're not a lawmaker, like, it just feels like that in the conservative media apparatus is doing what it feels a lot like, the word I liked is infotainment. It
Mm-hmm.
is what I feel like a lot of it is just degenerated to, because we would expect people in radio and media to let it all hang out in a sense, in just be totally out there in terms of what they say. But lawmakers, I'm reminded not just of the people who voted, what I thought was the right decision to impeach Trump for the actions he did on leading up to January 6th and on January 6th,
Oh, absolutely.
but also people around the world like Alexei Navalny, Juan Guaido, and the woman who defeated Lukashenko in Belarus, whose name I will not attempt to pronounce because I will not succeed. It just seems, it just seems like it's courage. Like, why do our elected leaders not have the courage to make the right decision that's not the popular decision?
I think there's a few reasons. First and foremost is probably just their political ambition is drowning out what they know is the right thing to do, or maybe they don't know what the right thing is to do.
I mean, you have
But
like the true believers like Paul Gosar and Matt Gaetz. Those
yeah,
people are like the true believers. But how about the everyday Republican, like, say, Mike Gallagher or Nancy Mace? These people probably know what the right thing to do is.
yeah, it's sad to know that so many Republicans think the best way to further their career is to go all in on Trump and pretend that January 6th wasn't a big deal, that Trump doesn't deserve any of the blame and shouldn't be held accountable. It's really depressing that they think that this is the best way for their career to advance their careers. And it's even more depressing that they may be right. And then, I think you're asking, like, how can other leaders around the world have courage and then some of our leaders here are lacking it? And I think it is in part because the stakes are lower. It's easier. Well, I don't know if I want to say it's easier, but when you know that other people are going to do the right thing for you, the right thing happening doesn't depend on you, because other people will step up and do the right thing and you can kind of, stand to the side. I think Mitch McConnell said on January 6th about the vote against certifying election results, he said something like, I will not pretend such a vote is a harmless protest gesture while relying on others to do the right thing. And I just think there's so much truth in that Republican senators like Josh Hawley can depend on other Republican senators to do the right thing while they do what they think is best for their career.
But in the
Yeah.
sense, they can't depend on them to do the right thing, because after Mitch McConnell gave that speech, he voted against convicting the president who instigated everything he just criticized him for. So I think in a sense the stakes are lower. I just You seem optimistic that people will do the right thing in the end. I'm a bit more pessimistic on that than you.
I am an eternal optimist. I think that's something I say on every single podcast or pretty much any piece I write. I think when it really comes down to it, people will do the right thing. I thought January 6th would have been that for more people in Congress, but I remain optimistic that we will get through this. Our country has definitely been through more challenging and more divisive times before and come out of them stronger, wiser, more committed, more united. And it wasn't so long ago that I think we recently celebrated Loving versus Virginia, which was a Supreme Court decision in like the 1960s that made interracial marriage constitutional in the United States. And like, I think segregation was alive and well during my own parents' lifetime. And so I do think, especially America is guided by our founding principles, and those principles lead us to right any wrongs and to try to prevent any additional injustices. And even though we're humans and humans are flawed and broken and we do the wrong thing sometimes before we do the right thing, we continue trying to do the right thing. And so that gives me optimism.
Let's talk about conservatism, and let's start with the issue that we've been talking about, because I think that, as you said, conservatives come from the same basic principles, but I think we might apply them differently. So let's start with the issue that Trump has been yapping on so long about. To what point does what happened reflect the need for new people in office, and to what extent does it reflect a need to change policy? And if there's a need to change policy, what level does it need to be done? Like the federal government or the states? What has to change, if anything?
So I'm going to answer the second part of that question first because it's the shorter answer, I think, which is just, I don't know. I have not fully thought through that question to provide an intelligent, responsible answer. I don't necessarily know if changing policy is the right response or what unintended consequences there might be. When it comes to, does January 6th and everything around it and everything that led up to it and everything that came after it mean we need new people in office? Absolutely. I think anyone who paid lip service to the idea that there was significant enough election fraud to overturn the election, or that Trump actually won and Biden stole it, anyone who is not willing to shoot those down and condemn them, not even like perpetuate them, but not willing to say, no, that's not true, I don't think they deserve any support. I would never personally vote for anyone who has acted as though there's any validity to those lies and conspiracy theories.
I think that, unfortunately, there's a long list of people, particularly in the House, of people who need to be given the boot. And unfortunately, some of them are leaving. They're just running for the Senate. Um, and I guess I'm more what I'm more worried about is less that we're going to clean house, but that more of them are going to get elected to office. That's my biggest worry.
I can definitely understand that, which is why, there's a lot of organizations out there that are centered around responsible conservatives and center right people running for office. I'm involved with WPLN, the Women's Public Leadership Network, that encourages and trains and supports center right women running for office. Just more people need to get involved at every level of government, within their communities, within their state. And, kind of like the wake up call I had a few years ago of like, you just can't depend on other people to do the right thing or to do the responsible thing. You need to step in as well.
And I hate to sound flippant, but you talk about the need to recruit better candidates for office, particularly women. Isn't that the kind of thing that Elise Stefanik used to do?
It is. And she is definitely someone who I am most disappointed in. I think her focus on supporting more women in primaries and Republican primaries is a great intention. I just feel as though she is almost entirely a different person than she was 2 years ago, especially when you look at like her social media. Now, Twitter feed sounds more and more like Trump's every single day compared to like the thoughtful, compassionate voice that she used to have on social media.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate what people will do in the pursuit of power.
Yes, which is also like, to me, the last 4 years of Trump, if the one thing, well, not one thing, but one thing that I was optimistic about from 2016 onward is I was like, hey, maybe this will make more people support limited government. If someone they disagree with as much as Trump can be in charge of the federal government, maybe this is a sign that the federal government shouldn't have this much power. Maybe this is a sign that we should focus on local and state solutions, and that we shouldn't be looking for one size fits all federal solutions that, may work in one state on one side of the country with its population, but won't work for another state with entirely different needs and an entirely different population. That has been a little disappointing to me. I thought more people on the left would come around to supporting more limited government than did.
I sort of had a bit of a more pragmatic hope, admittedly. After the last 4 years, my hope is that the next time a politician comes on the stage, or anyone running for office comes on stage saying that another country will pay for something, that they get laughed off the stage.
I know. Isn't the Texas governor right now talking about how Texas will pay for the wall now?
Yeah, no, we're going to get to Texas in a moment, because I want to talk about some things that's going on in the conservative movement, because I feel like in some ways like you said, the loudest voices in conservatism have lost their way. You might have remembered Michael Knowles from the Daily Wire mocked those who care more about occupational licensing reform than issues like pronouns, critical race theory, and bathrooms. Like, his whole shtick has been culture wars. And he even said, people are really concerned about occupational licensing reform, even though, by the way, occupational licensing reform has done more to help people than any of them are talking about.
Yeah, makes a real difference in people's lives.
Yeah, what they did in Oklahoma City recently. The mayor of Oklahoma City, like, they eliminated a bunch of occupational licensing requirements. This is a city that with a Republican mayor, that's been trending Democratic. So what have they been doing to stay in power? They've been making people's lives better.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's just after like every single story about occupational licensing reform, you can see the difference it makes in people's lives, about people's ability to earn a living for themselves and support their families and not have to rely on their communities or their government. And some of these occupational licenses are just so ridiculous, like about like requiring more hours to braid hair than to like be an EMT or something like that. That may not be exactly it, but I know there's one where it requires more hours to do something like that than it does to become an EMT or, like, I think a police officer.
I had a certain U.S. senator from East Virginia on to talk about this issue.
I love her.
Yeah. That I was hoping I'd get you guys back to back, but hey, I'm glad to have you now.
Next time you should try to do it together, because I always love talking to Shoshana.
I will try to organize that. But I guess one thing that's been more concerning for me is that Texas and Florida, there have been a bunch of states that have been pandering to anti-vaxxers, people who believe things about vaccines that are not true. That is what I believe they are trying to pander to. I know I'm cynical, but that's, but what Florida and Texas did is particularly egregious, because they're telling private businesses who to let onto their property. When did it become cool for Republicans to tell private businesses what to do?
Well, I think that's kind of the flips we were talking about earlier, where we saw ourselves as Republicans because they supported and defended certain principles, like private government or private businesses' right to make their own decisions. And now it seems as though it is really about enforcing or forcing private businesses to do what they want and then punishing them if they don't, or if they speak out of turn, or if they criticize Republicans. And it's just deeply frustrating.
Yeah, the Republicans who when the NBA, came out in support of Black Lives Matter, they said cut their tax break that they have.
Right. Which, it's one thing if you decide to get rid of a tax break because you determine it's crony capitalism, and not actually the free market. It's another to cut a tax break because you want to punish someone's speech. And so many of these things, these situations occurring, are more about punishing a corporation's speech because certain Republicans don't like what they're saying.
Sarah, have you heard of the Claremont Institute?
I have. I'm not super familiar with it, though. I've just seen it in passing.
I just feel like a lot of the speeches that I've seen given, sponsored by that organization, or some of the articles they put out, have essentially been, sort of the same mindset that, the left is a threat, and everything we do has to be about fighting them. And I feel like that so much of it has come down to that.
Yes, I will say most of the things I've seen from there, I am not a fan of because I don't agree with them.
But I just feel like that's permeating into what people who are not Claremont, who are more mainstream.
Mhm.
I feel like that's permeating into some of the stuff that they see, like particularly in conservative infotainment.
Right. And I mean, I think hopefully at this point we all know that Twitter is not real life, but you do see it on Twitter a lot where it's like new rules, or I'm just playing by your rules, or you made up these rules, let's play by them. And it's just an excuse to punish people, to try to hurt people, to go against the principles you say you believe in because that's what you argue other people are doing. So why not do it right back?
Right. It's quote unquote playing by their rules. It's just I've never
Yeah.
been a fan of that mindset. But I think similar to an earlier point that I made is among the other Republicans who have gotten a fetish for big government is Josh Hawley,
Mm.
who suddenly thinks that we should be regulating big tech, Elizabeth Warren style. And you also had, to a lesser extent, Marco Rubio basically said, oh, workers, you should unionize because Amazon censors conservatives. This is another example, I think, of what you and I have been talking about of Republicans, suddenly, figuring out that big government is popular, but even though it's not what's best.
Well, and also victimhood is very profitable. I will say that for, a really long time, the Republican Party was criticized the left because they would say that it was all about who was the bigger victim, who had the bigger right to being a victim. And it seems as though rather than continuing to try to fight that mentality, a lot of Republicans now want to go on it as well. They want to be a victim. They want to grift. They want to, you know, spread falsehoods about Amazon banning their books, which I think did happen to one specific book, but I know recently like there was a glitch in the system where Amazon, like the search function wasn't working. And so many people on the left and the right started tweeting about it, saying that Amazon is trying to silence me because that's a profitable position to be in. Like there's just so much anger out there. And if you can position yourself as a victim of like big tech or corporations or the government, like that's a sweet spot to be in, to get more attention, to get more followers, to get more money. So
I will say this, just to be optimistic. For every grifter that's successful, there's another grifter that gets, as I like to say, walled. WHLED. That Jacob Wall, the guy who
oh
the guy who
has kind
epically
of disappeared.
yeah, no, I have never seen a bigger failure than him.
Yeah. Or even what's that guy's name? Milo? I
Milo
never know how to pronounce
Yiannopoulos.
it. Yes.
Milo, yeah.
He's
Back,
kind of disappeared too.
yeah, back when the Reagan Battalion at Reagan Battalion was actually principled conservative, they were the ones who exposed him.
Oh, I don't know if I knew that.
Yeah, there's an account called Reagan Battalion. Don't follow them. I think I haven't followed them in a while, so I don't know what they're up to these days.
Related to what you were saying about grifters, I just saw earlier today, I think that Roger Stone is now telling people to boycott Parlor,
Parlor, I think.
because he's saying, I think like it's silencing MAGA or something, but
That is
it
funny.
really is just like every movement tends to eat their own. The left eats their own for not being woke enough. The right eats their own for not being MAGA enough. Like, and it's just, there are some people you'll just never be enough for. You will never make them happy. They will always move on to the next grifter who is louder, angrier, whatever than you. So my thing is like, why even try? Like, just say what you believe in.
Let's move on to funner topics because it is Pride Month. It is the day after Juneteenth. Actually, believe it or not, here in my hometown, Pride Month is in August. So you're going to be
Oh.
seeing all my Pride Month tweets in about a month and a half from now. You've talked about, by the way, the need for the Republican Party to grow and to advocate for conservatism among people in places that we usually don't go into. I think you and Shoshana have talked about the need for Republicans to compete in cities. You've talked about the need for Republicans to do outreach to people of color, to women, and to people who are LGBT. How's that going so far?
It's interesting because, like, I think I want to say, like, in 2020, Trump actually did better with some groups of people than I would have expected. My perspective is that all politics is a form of identity politics. You are trying to
That
appeal.
is nihilistic. I'm sorry. That is, but
But
go on.
I don't think identity politics is necessarily negative. I think there's identity politics and then there's pandering. And the pandering is what's negative to me. Or, yeah, I think all politics is a form of identity politics. You're always trying to appeal to certain groups of people. And it has always been frustrating to me to hear people say conservative principles, not the Republican Party, but conservative principles are racist or sexist or homophobic like that, because they're not at all. The principles themselves are, pro liberty, pro individual, pro opportunity. It is the people who use them for their own purposes that give them this negative connotation, which is really frustrating to me. But absolutely, I think conservative principles of limited government and the free market and free speech should appeal to people in cities, to women, to people of color, to minorities and the marginalized. Things like free speech, the First Amendment has historically been a tool for people without a voice to speak up against their government, to speak out for their rights. Like feminists during the 19th and 20th centuries, they used the First Amendment and all the freedoms with it to build support for the right to vote for themselves and to organize around their belief that they should have the right to vote. So it's just frustrating to me when I hear people say that if we increase immigration, Republicans will always lose, because that's like ridiculous. You can reach out to people and make them understand why conservative principles will allow them to prosper and flourish. You shouldn't just give up on that.
Outside of the U.S., in Canada, places like I said Canada's like places, places like Canada and the UK and elsewhere. The right of center party in those countries is actually very much has a base of support with immigrants. It's something that Republicans choose not to do, but could very well do if they were interested in it.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people on the right, not everyone, but a lot of people on the right will like point to California and be like, California is an example of why Republicans like lose with different groups of people. But Texas and Florida, like, look how successful we are there with other groups of people.
Yeah.
Like, it's just so self-defeating.
And the crazy thing is, we don't even have to compromise on a single issue. For example, one thing that conservatives are doing, there is a large Hong Kong community in Vancouver. We're reaching out to them on the issue of Hong Kong freedom, in order to get their votes. Yeah.
Hong Kong. There are certain senators who voted against support for Hong Kong residents and then want to go to Hong Kong just for the photo ops, and it is so frustrating.
As frustrating as that is, at least you can they can count themselves among the people who did not compare the U.S. and Israel to the Taliban, and
yeah.
you know who I'm talking about.
Yes, over and over, she just makes those comments.
Those three, I think that Ayanna Pressley is sometimes unfairly looped in with the other three.
There was a really good article that more or less like was her coming out and saying that, like, because I was in a photo with them, that AOC, I think, captioned the squad. Now I always get looped in with them, but I don't always agree with her, especially given she's on the left and I'm on the right, but I would be frustrated to be consistently looped in with them as well.
Right, and I also say this to my leftist and conservative friends, that the other three members of the squad, like AOC, Ilhan Omar, and Rashida Tlaib, their best thing that they're able to do is be loudmouths. And they have a large Twitter following, but they don't have a lot of legislative influence. If there's anyone that we conservatives should be afraid of actually getting progressive policies enacted, it is Ayanna Pressley, because she actually knows what she's doing in terms of building coalitions and things like that. I just, one of the things I worry about, like just like with the magotization of the Republican Party, I think in some ways I'm worried about the Corbynization of the Democratic Party. I'm worried about more people like those three members of the squad and like Jamal Bowman, getting elected, in easy to win seats, and it's progressivism at the expense of things that we believe in, obviously, but also you know governing. I think that we're not going to get everything we want, but what's happening is that both parties, and Republicans and increasingly Democrats, are electing people who care about getting what they want at all costs, instead of getting things done. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I will say one thing that, gave me hope is the Democratic Party nominating Joe Biden over Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren. And I think you see time and time again that although AOC gets an outsized amount of attention, the party doesn't appear to be following her as much as obviously she would like, but maybe is off. What was I even saying? The party doesn't seem to be following her as much as we would think based on what we see on Twitter as
Right.
well. And I think there was an article, I haven't had the opportunity to read it yet. I was just seeing
Just
it
very
floating
quickly,
around on
very
Twitter.
quickly, very quickly. I just want to say I'm probably one of the few conservatives who has AOC on mute. But go on.
That's smart. I think my husband does too. Because anytime she tweets something, it just takes over your whole timeline with everyone quote tweeting it or responding to it.
But I think we can also choose to ignore her. I think that
Yes.
she has as much influence as we give her.
Yes, I agree with that.
You were saying something about before I interrupted you. You were saying something.
Oh, yeah. So I haven't read the article yet, but I saw snippets floating around on Twitter, and it was something about like there was a lifelong Democratic voter being like, I voted for Joe Biden. I didn't like Trump. I've never been a Republican, but I don't like the direction of that AOC and her squad are trying to take the Democratic Party in. And I do think there are more voters like that on the left than we realize. I do think that this country is more center right. But again, it's just the loudest voices are the loudest because they're the most extreme.
Speaking of center right, I sometimes feel like there are issues like for example education and taxes where I feel like we have the winning position. Like we want better economic opportunities, and we believe that you should not have to pay as much in taxes. We believe that you should be able to send your child to the school of your choice.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that on other issues we got a bit of work to do, because I feel like there are issues like climate change and healthcare where I feel like we've just been the party of no, and we've said we haven't. I feel like we haven't put forward, and at least until recently, our own conservative solutions to some of those issues. And while at the risk of asking you to solve climate change and healthcare in 10 minutes, is there anything like, because like there have been organizations like American Conservation Coalition which have done a lot to get Republicans to put forward conservative solutions to climate change. I just sometimes wish that there was more of this, and what more can we do to say yes to conservative solutions?
That's a great question. I was actually going to bring up ACC as well. But absolutely, you have a point where like you look at healthcare, and the Republican Party has been promising to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act for like 12 years now. And it doesn't seem like we have a plan. Like there's still no plan for how to fix the cost of healthcare in this country. And I'll just say, if I had to come up with like a one sentence summary of my political stance, and this is definitely an extreme generalization, it's not applicable in every case, but in 30 seconds, I think I would say, I think the left identifies many issues, some of which are not real issues and some of which are valid. And they also offer a lot of solutions to those issues, some of which are valid solutions, most of which I think as a conservative are insane, that are not effective, not efficient, not productive, will not actually solve the problem at hand. I think the right usually, for the most part, refuses to identify any issues, and as a result, refuses to offer any solutions. And so what happens is, because the left is mostly being the one identifying issues and offering solutions.
They're setting
And
the tone of the conversation.
yes, the right I don't want to say the right, but so much of the right refuses to even participate in these conversations, refuses to offer conservative-based solutions, refuses to try to like bring the conversation back over maybe a little bit more conservative, more realistic. But instead, they just refuse to participate at all. And as a result, like you said, the left gets to set the tone of the conversation, gets to shift it in their direction, gets to offer solutions. And they, to so many voters, they look like they're offering solutions, and the right looks like they're not doing anything at all.
The only person I've actually seen offer like a real conservative response to healthcare is Heath. He had an article, like I think like a series of articles last year, who talking about what a conservative solution to healthcare would look like. But he's the only one I think who's done something like that.
Yeah, I'm struggling to think of any like conservative media outlet that has come up with one as well, which doesn't mean anything. I'm sure somewhere someone has, and I just haven't
Right.
seen it.
People will often point out that there was a Republican senator who introduced, I guess, in the 90s, who introduced a bill that kind of looks like Obamacare. It's kind of not. It had the regulations, but it didn't have any way to fund it. It also had tort reform as well, which Obamacare does not. I sometimes try to wonder what a conservative solution to healthcare would look like, because it does seem like America is sort of the, it seems like every other country that has come up with a solution, it is admittedly, every other country has tried something that's a bit more socialist, and sometimes what I wonder is, whether the system that gets adopted specifically for healthcare is a mixed system in someone, say something like what Great Britain does, or that has elements of socialism, but also has elements of the private sector. But I don't know what healthcare would ultimately look like when the best solution gets adopted. I just don't know what that would look like.
Yeah, it's definitely tough for sure. I would like to see more people. People are definitely doing this. I would like to see more people acknowledge that it may not be the best solution to have health insurance linked to your employer, that there's too much collusion between, pharmaceutical companies and insurance companies and hospitals, that we need, more innovation to try and come up with cheaper alternatives. And then also, I'd like to see the left acknowledge that solutions that work for other countries aren't as valid for the United States, A, because of the uniqueness of our country, but B, because of how much of our money goes towards research and development that, assists the rest of the world. So much of the world depends on the United States for this R&D and medical R&D that we just can't rely on other countries to take up in our absence. So
Right. I just think that the best solutions would increase supply and decrease demand. Like, I think one issue would be to emphasize preventative healthcare, like wellness, incentivize people to keep themselves healthy, like exercise and have a balanced diet. I feel like that in the long run would lower costs if we're overall a healthier nation. I think that would
Right.
ease some of the stress.
And screenings. I'm very devoted to making sure everyone gets screened for their health now after having a health scare last summer.
But I guess I just want to end on a positive note, because I know that we're not going to solve healthcare or climate change tonight. I remember on your Twitter profile it says it was an Anne Frank quote.
Yes, in spite of everything, I still believe people are good at heart.
So on that note, like, what gives you the most optimism for everything that's to come?
I don't know if there's anything I can point to specifically. I mean, if I had to come up with like one, I might say Joe Biden getting the Democratic nomination in 2020 instead of Bernie Sanders. I was really thankful for that. There's two other things I would say that are a bit more general, but I think just the awareness of human nature and history. I feel like I see a lot on social media, people expressing like, people are worse today, people don't care about each other like they used to, things were better in the olden days, and like that's just not true. There's human nature is what it is. We try to get better, we do get better, but there are some things that are just inherent to human nature. And despite that, we keep trying to do the best we can. And I touched on earlier, just like the stability of our government. We are really fortunate to have the government system that we do, where it was able to withstand a lot of the abuses from 2016 to 2020 that were put onto it. And just, the little things like on Twitter where you see people raising money for total strangers and people offering prayers for total strangers and hoping for the best for them. And it's things like that that give me a lot of hope and optimism. And also the human need for connection. The older I get, the more I realize how much we thrive on our social groups. Even like there's, some random Reddit forums that are like very specifically about like, I don't know, like retiring early or about snarking on like books from your childhood. And even with those forums, these people will form like little subgroups for off-topic discussions because they want a community. On Twitter, people form group DMs because they want a community. And like Twitter helped me find a community during the 2016 election when I felt really politically homeless. So it's just, humans are flawed, but we're also just capable of so much greatness. And, that is very inspiring to me.
Well, we're gonna have to leave it there. I definitely want to, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining. I definitely want to have you back, along with Shoshana and maybe Danielle Butcher as well, and Hannah Cox. Like, let's have the whole crew on.
That would be
But
awesome.
yeah, that would be awesome. Anyway, have a happy belated Juneteenth.
You too, and thank you for inviting me on.